Chicken fabrication. When you get your chicken, look for the grading and inspection stamp. Those will both be in place. Unwrap your chicken, and the first thing you'll do is remove the giblets, the neck, the heart, the liver, and the gizzard. Remove the excess lumbar or kidney fat from the cavity of the body. Bring the chicken to your cutting board. Here are the legs. And in order to remove the legs, you hold the leg up and there will be a natural line of fat. Where you see the tension, make an incision in the skin. Careful not to cut through any flesh. Recognize where the thigh meets the cavity, and then holding your knife flush to the cavity, cut down against the bones through the tail. At that point in time, release the skin with your boning knife along the top of the thigh and turn the chicken over. Pop the joint out of place, the thigh joint, and then keeping the knife flush to the cavity, cut along the backbone and into the joint, cutting through the cartilage where the joint meets, tucking your finger behind the oyster into the pocket, tearing back and removing with your knife the thigh and the leg intact. The oyster cavity should be completely clear of any meat. Having the bird facing you, here are its legs. There is the breast meat, that is the top, or the front part of the chicken. This is where the neck was. This is where its internal organs were. This is the back, the thighs, and these are the wings. Here is a natural line of fat that runs along the pelvic bone, the thigh, and the top of the leg meat. To remove the leg and the thigh intact, recognize where the pelvic cavity begins and make an incision in the skin along the thigh meat above the pelvic cavity. Recognize where the thigh meets the carcass. It's really important that we make sure the skin continuously covers the top of the bird because we want to be able to protect that. Holding the bird up by the leg, cut through the skin across the top of the thigh, the natural fat line to the back, and moving the joint at the hip, you can recognize there's a small muscle right above the hip socket called the oyster. Pop the thigh joint out of place and come in behind the oyster with your finger, and with your knife, you're going to tuck your knife into the top part of that joint and tuck that meat right out of there. You want to remove all that meat that ensures that you get the entire portion of the thigh. Keeping your knife flush against the cavity and against the backbone, cut through the skin, and you're going to come to where the cartilage of the thigh joint meets the hip socket, and you cut right through that and remove it. You'll repeat the same process on the next side, again remembering to come in right above the pelvic cavity. Recognize where the natural fat line meets the leg and above the thigh, keeping the breast meat covered with skin. Come through right across the top of the thigh, popping the joint out of socket, tucking your knife in, recognizing where the oyster is, pop the tip of your knife right in there, tuck your finger behind, and pull forward, cutting through the cartilage where the thigh joint meets the hip socket and down into the tail to remove the leg and thigh intact. Again, both sockets should be completely clear of meat. What we're left with next is the breast meat. So the first thing we're going to do is recognize where the wishbone is. We want to remove the wishbone because this creates ease in removing the breast meat intact without leaving too much on the carcass. So find the wishbone and scrape away from both sides. It should come up and meet in the center at the top where the keel bone, where the two breast pieces come together. And sometimes you'll find that it'll be broken. If so, just recognize where it is, find it with your fingers, tuck your finger behind, and with your knife and your fingers, scrape the meat away from that and pull it out. Don't forget about the top portion. There's a little bit of cartilage that connects the two bones together at the very top. You want to make sure just to sneak those right on out of there. Your boning knife is your greatest tool in this. Then what you're left with is your 2 lobes of breast meat. You want to gently score the skin and expose where the keel bone or the breastplate comes together between the 2 lobes of breast meat. What we're looking to do is remove one side and then the other. So coming in flush with your boning knife, nice and tight to the keel bone, you're going to tuck in right next to that cartilage, and you're going to gently scrape away in nice clean strokes, pulling also with your fingers the flesh away from the keel boning, leaving very little meat on the carcass. Follow along the cartilage, keeping your knife flush to the cartilage and the bone, and you're going to peel away the meat from the cavity, remembering that you have the rib cage to go around, remembering the structure of the bird. From the front of the bird, you will come to a place on the back side where the wishbone was, where the wing articulates with the rib cage and the shoulder blade on the cavity. At that point, you want to find where the tenderloin is, and the tenderloin has a tendon in place that you will need to cut through that tendon. That's a major muscle that helps to move the wing. Recognize where the joint is and cut cleanly through the joint, angling your knife towards the carcass itself. We always want to reserve the meat or preserve the meat. This is going to be an airline breast, so we are going to cut through the first wing joint here, right below where it would meet at perhaps the first elbow or first joint of the wing. Scraping down, we cut through the tendons and remove those so that they're easy to remove the remainder of the wing. Pulling in an opposite direction, you should be able to pop the next 2 segments of the wing off, leaving a very clean bone. In order to make buffalo wings, you would cut through the tip and the second joint of the wing portion, the tip going into stock and the second portion going into another recipe, perhaps buffalo wings or sweet and sour chicken wings, something of that nature. What you're left with then is an airline breast or a supreme cut. We want to make sure that the meat itself is covered with skin, but we want to cut off the excess skin and any kind of residual huge amounts of fat. And then we also want to remove the tenderloin. The tenderloin can be used for something different, such as chicken fingers. Little kids love this type of food. You can use it for another recipe if needed. And this is an airline breast. Voila. The next side, come in on the other side of the keel bone, replicating exactly what you did on your first side, peeling away the chicken meat from the carcass, making sure your knife stays nice and tight next to the cavity itself, following around against the rib cage, peeling away the meat from the bones, coming to a place where you meet the joint where the wing articulates and the shoulder blade articulates with the cavity itself. Come through and cut off through the joint, leaving the carcass, which can be used for stock. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make this a boneless breast. So recognizing where the wing articulates with the breast meat, removing the tenderloin so that's out of your way, and angling your knife, you want to come through and you're going to recognize where the 2 muscle groups come together. Angling your knife towards the wing, because of breast meat we can get far more money from putting that on the plate than a chicken wing. We come through where you have that connective tissue and fat, intermuscular fat. You'll cut through and remove the wing in its entirety, leaving a boneless breast. Now here you have some pockets of arteries and connective tissue that we want to remove. Remember that when connective tissue cooks, it constricts and it becomes tough to eat, so we don't want our guests to necessarily have to chew through that on the plate. So we took the time to go ahead and remove that. That can go into stock. Connective tissue melts down, creates body in stock. We're looking for that. You're going to clean off any kind of excess fat or skin, but leaving the breast meat completely covered with skin to protect it and give us the ability to cook whatever we want from there. So there's a boneless breast of chicken. Coming in at the three, you have 2 joints. So again, this goes to buffalo wings. You're going to cut through with your elbow joint or the joints down. Remember that if you hit bone, it's going to be tough to cut through, so recognize where your cartilage is and cut right through that. The tips go into stock, and those 2 pieces, the flat tip and the buffalo tip, are delicious to eat. Next we have our leg in and thigh attached. We are going to go ahead and separate these. Recognize where the fat line is and open up with your knife the skin. See where the 2 pieces meet at the joints, and you want to cut straight through those, leaving the joint looking like a molar, clean molar. You don't want to necessarily cut through the joint. Trim off the excess skin. You want to have enough skin to cover your meat. It helps protect it and it tastes good when you cook it. So that is a very nice drumstick or bone-in leg. And then you have our bone-in thigh. Trim out any kind of excess fat. We just want enough fat to cover the skin, and using nice clean strokes, remove any excess skin, and any pockets of arteries you see, you probably want to peel those out of there, but there's a nice bone-in thigh. Now we want to bone out the thigh and the leg intact. So right where the foot portion of the chicken was, you want to cut a little bit further up in order to relieve any tendons or arteries that are connected. Those are very tough when they're cooked, so it's important that you go ahead and get rid of those to start with. From the thigh bone, make an incision through the meat and open up the chicken and expose the thigh and the leg bone, scraping away the meat, trying to come around the cartilage where the hip socket was, where the knee joint is, and scrape, 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 scrape away. There will be some meat left on the bone. Don't worry about that. We're going to put those right into stock, so not a big deal. But you do want to try and get as much meat off as possible. There's a teeny tiny little bone in the leg, so just remember to be careful or cautious of that. Come around that, and again, you're going to scrape off the meat from around the bones, come up to the joint where the knee is, holding onto both. Scrape away again the meat, trying to leave the cartilage on the bones themselves, leaving as little cartilage as possible on the thigh and the leg meat, because we're going to have to take that off in the end part anyway. And just be conscientious to not pierce the skin. We want to make sure the skin maintains intactness so that we can stuff this or we can do whatever we want with this. The leg and the thigh bone go into stock. Looks pretty good. Quite lovely, don't you think? Stock. Okay. Next, you want to come through. We're going to clean off any kind of excess fat. And then you see that this is a nice little package. The skin hasn't been pierced. It's not compromised in any way, shape, or form. We're going to cut out any kind of excessive fat. Chicken fat tastes good, so you don't have to get rid of all of it. But one thing we do have to alleviate this meat of is tendons, because tendons will coagulate and stick out and look you in the eye when you're eating your food, and that's not what you're looking for. That's not what your guest wants either. They become very tough and chewy, and so we need to take the time to make sure that we're very, very careful about removing these from the leg portion of this part of the bird. The boneless leg and thigh takes a little bit more time to fabricate, but it's definitely worth it. So we want to definitely make sure that we're coming in and ridding any kind of connective or tough pieces of connective tissue that might impede our guests' enjoyment of their dining experience. So come through. There's probably about 10, maybe 15 or so little nasty tendons in there. And then open up the meat where you see pockets of fat. Fat hides arteries, and arteries are another thing that we don't necessarily want to feed our guest in great quantity. So tuck your knife in there, just peel out those excess arteries and fat, investigate the little pockets. It doesn't have to be perfect again, because fat also tastes good. As long as it's not super huge pockets of it, it will melt down. Pay close and careful attention to make sure that any kind of residual cartilage is removed from the bird. And if any little pockets of meat fall off, go ahead and tuck them into that hole that's left where the knee joint was. And because we're going to stuff this piece of meat, it's an easy way to go ahead and not waste that and put it in with the food, or put it on the plate so that we can charge for it. And there you have cut off anything excess, and voila, a boneless leg and thigh attached. Here's your final product. This is what it should look like. You have a carcass, you have 2 tenderloins, bone-in breast, airline, bone-out breast, or boneless breast,